So intergovernmental organizations are composed of states. Multinational corporations are businesses. And we've seen the rise of multinational corporations over the 20th century in particular, although they've existed for longer. These are firms that produce, distribute, and market goods in more than one country. They've got huge assets, and, power is fungible. So what this means is they can become very formidable political players. Again, the notion of power fungibility. Economic power can become political power can be translated into economic power. Multinational corporations can affect domestic and international politics by converting their economic power into political power. For example, they can force a country to relax its labor laws in return for an investment, which can, in turn, increase state capacity. In a democracy, we can tax them. Or it can increase the amount of rents in a non-democracy. So the corrupt guys will take aspects, they'll take bribes for allowing these investments, or they will simply take taxes, quote unquote, from the investments. Again, so this gives the multinational corporations political power as well, using their economic strength to gain political power. Some countries gain at the expense of others very clearly when it comes to the role of multinational corporations. Think about offshore accounts. Switzerland has a quarter of the world's offshore money, amounting to about $2 trillion as of 2010 or so. These are tax havens, which until recently have kept their clients' names and information secret from prying governments who are going after tax evaders, who are going after war criminals, who are going after terrorists. This hurts countries like the United States, right? Because we don't get to tax these multinational corporations that are putting their money in these offshore accounts. But think about poorer states such as Libya, such as Iraq. Many states where there are dictators, various authoritarian regimes that keep their money in offshore accounts that can't be touched. Okay, these states are ones in which you lack real capacity, in part because you don't have money. Well, where's the money going? Another problem is the nature of sweatshops, and there are a myriad of problems. These are just a couple to think about. What multinational corporations do is they increase competitive pressures on those countries where you have more rights given to workers. So, for example, Nike, and I shouldn't even say Nike, but I'm going to say Nike, and it could be any kind of Gap. Oh, Gap was just caught doing this before. But let's just say Nike. Nike will come in and they'll produce in Sri Lanka where workers earn $1 a day, rather than Alabama where they get $50 a day. So what this does is it puts competitive pressures on places like, Bangladesh. If you've got a guarantee that your workers earn $2 a day, well, we Nike aren't going to invest there. So you better get rid of that law that has a minimum wage. And so what you find is increasingly cheap labor, lower health standards, lower safety standards, lower environmental standards. All these things are lowered by the states in order to encourage this investment. And this is known as the race to the bottom. Okay, very important phrase, race to the bottom. Deplete your standards in order to compete with the others. Multinational corporations can also involve violent interference in state sovereignty. They can undermine state stability. An example, the Congo has been the focal point for international gold companies. Lots of gold there. An Anglo-American subsidiary, Anglo-American's a huge huge mining company. An Anglo-American subsidiary around 2003 linked up with this murderous armed group, the Nationalist and Integrationist Front, FNI, and helped these rebels access gold-rich mining sites. They gave financial and logistical support to rebels, claiming that these relationships were, quote-unquote, unavoidable since they already controlled certain territory. But what they did is they really undermined the state as it existed. They were feeding rebels in order to have access once these rebels got this gold-rich mining site or a couple sites. These resources could be used to strengthen state security and help rebuild the war-ravaged country. But instead, again, thanks to multinational corporations, the gold is being used to fuel fighting and undermine the state. The same goes for the diamond trade, and that's become a very big issue. Now we can move on to non-governmental organizations. These are national or international groups that are focused on policy objectives. These groups use the power of moral suasion, including state-level peer pressure, as well as public pressure, both elite and non-elite, in order to press for change in a range of countries. And what I mean by elite public pressure is literally putting pressure on elites to do something, and by non-elite is by galvanizing the public and getting them to put pressure on these elites through letter writing campaigns, etc. So an example of this is the anti-slavery movement. Up to the start of the 19th century, slavery was legal almost everywhere, but it was especially brutal and most extensive in the United States. Now, a vocal minority here in the U.S. saw this as barbaric, and they organized these abolitionist groups. These are early non-governmental organizations. And what they did is they issued speeches, published pamphlets, they preached in churches, engaged in various protests. And that's how they tried to persuade various state leaders to actually come to their side. They were aided by the economic interests of non-slave countries, especially Great Britain, which said that slavery was unfair competition. So here you have these unusual bedfellows. They're coming at it for different points of view. One of them from a moral point of view, these abolitionist groups, but then they take on allies who are thinking more about the economic side of it. So in 1807, they got legislation in the US and in the UK which delegalized the import of trades, but it was very hard to enforce. Abolitionists continued to press their case at the Congress of Vienna. In 1819, the Congress of Vienna was set up to settle the French Revolutionary Wars and redraw Europe's political map. Delegates of the Congress of Vienna called the slave trade repugnant to the principles of humanity and universal morality. And then abolitionists in the US, the UK, and France called for boycotts on slave-made goods. They organized letter campaigns to officials. They sponsored lectures by fugitive slaves. They launched press campaigns. This was a transnational advocacy group. It was a group of connected organizations working transnationally, in other words, across borders, with shared values, a common discourse, and this very dense exchange of information. So again, what NGOs mean are more and further reaching voices of citizens in politics, different groups of citizens. So multinational corporations are also the role of certain citizens in politics. Here you've got a broader, doesn't have to be so broad, it can be quite actually elite and quite narrow interests as well. But they're a new access point for citizens to get involved in politics, and they also represent the spread or really involve the spread of ideas and tactics and alliances. Intergovernmental organizations actually give many NGOs a forum to generate pressure. Again, often merely moral, but they're highly effective. For example, Amnesty International used the United Nations, an intergovernmental organization, to promote and pass a law on banning torture back in the early 1980s. So they can be quite effective.